welcome.
Thank you so much.
All right. So, with a general question, what kind of horror writer are you? What are some themes and ideas that you tend to like to explore in your works?
So I'm a pretty classical horror writer in a sense that, you know, the way I got into horror writing, the way I grew up, I was told scary stories. And I think the best thing for any child to have is a storyteller in their lifetime. And I had a couple. My uncle told me scary stories. He lived in Amsterdam. I live in the eastern part of the Netherlands. And we would spend weekends there, my sister and I, and he would turn off the lights, sit on the edge of the bed, and tell Bram Stoker's Dracula, for instance, when I was 7 years old, or The Witches by Roald Dahl when I was 8 years old, I think. So he told the good stuff, and it scared the hell out of me. And I especially remember him telling The Witches, where Roald Dahl's novel, obviously, where the witches in the book, they have claws, so they wear gloves. And it was winter in Amsterdam when he told me the story, and everyone on the streets were wearing gloves. So
Oh, that was
my
on
child,
purpose.
that was on purpose. My childhood traumatized mind after, a whole night of nightmares would see witches everywhere around me. So it's that kind of the classic storytelling that got me into, telling my own stories. Next to that, some bad stuff had happened in my life. When I was 3 years old, my father had passed away suddenly, and the way I envisioned death was it was something that was living in our attic, in between the laundromat and like the washing lines. It was like this dark space where it would come down from to get me and my mom or my sister as well if we would make too much noise on the stairs. So there was kind of a very vivid imagination of what death was, and I was scared as hell of it, obviously. And I soon found that the only way to give meaning to these kind of feelings was to tell my own stories about it. And um, I started reading horror stories, the classics first. Then, I mean, in the Netherlands, I was obviously dependent on translation because there isn't a lot of um, traditional horror fiction. Actually, none at all in the Netherlands. We don't really have a tradition of our own horror folklore. So there were like Stephen King, Clive Barker, Dean Koontz, and Peter Straub were the translated horror authors, basically. Later on, came a little bit broader, but not much broader. So I was dependent on them. And then when I started reading in English in my puberty, then my scope broadened, and that's how I got into horror. And then, so the kind of horror that I write is based on all those experiences, plus my very down to earth Dutch background, I think.
Hmm. And how have your inspirations and motivations evolved over time as well? Because a lot of times that'll change as the years go by and you work on new things. Has that happened?
That it has happened, and most of all that I throughout the years I've gotten more aware of my own background, where I come from. The Netherlands is a very secular country. Religion doesn't really play a big part in our lives anymore. We're very down to earth people. We're very, um, I always imagined if, you know, in any sane person's house, um, in the middle of the night, a witch turns up in your bedroom, and just on the brink, when you come out of the shower and you want to get ready for bed, um, you scream and you run, right? If that happens into a Dutch person's house, you just hang the towel over the witch's face, and then dry yourself off and go to bed. We're
Another
very,
Tuesday.
yeah, exactly. And then that practicality of dealing with life, I translated that into practicality of dealing with the supernatural. In my work, what I've experienced, what makes my work different than work from most authors, I think, is the very practical dealings with the supernatural. In Hex, for instance, my breakthrough novel, Um, there is a witch in a certain town that keeps all these townsfolk captured in that town, and they have an app on their phone where they track her whereabouts. They, when she shows up next to the one of the main roads, people can't see her. People from outside cannot see her because then all hell break loose. But so they just like build a tool shed around her, plant a shrubbery in front of her, just to get her out. It's very practical dealing with the supernatural,
Mm-hmm.
and that same sense translates in all my novels, I think.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. And earlier we were talking about how your mind went, running wild, imagining claws under, gloved
Yeah,
gloves in the winter. So
yeah.
how how do you try to, spur on the audience's imagination in your works? What are tools and themes that you use and you like to use to, really make people, fear for claws under gloves?
Yeah. So what I tend to do is I take a certain archetype of the genre, right? Like and twist it around in a fresh way. That's my go-to method to come up with my stories. Again, in Hex, I wanted to tell like a haunted town story, a witchcraft story, and I remember I, I wrote a bit of a concept for it, like a two-page outline of what I had in mind, and it was kind of a general, haunted town story, and it wasn't very original. And I showed it to a friend, and he burned it to the ground, and rightly so, because it lacked the originality. And so what we did, okay, let's have some fun about it. So what can we do? And then the moment we had the idea, what if people are not actually afraid of her, but what if they're just annoyed by her presence and indeed just hang a dishcloth over her face when she pops up in their houses for the X many time?
Oh.
Um,
Oh, I
that
just
made it
needed to try this shirt. Thank you.
exactly, yeah, yeah. But of course, underneath the surface, they're still very much scared because we all share the superstitious fear of the supernatural. Um, so that made it work. So take a general concept of horror fiction and turn it around. I did the same in Echo, my new book, where um, it's a possession novel. I love possession novels, but what I don't like too much about possession is there's always a strong religious counterpart. It's always possession by the devil or a demon, and then there's a priest coming to exercise or some holy man coming to exercise. We've seen that. It's been done. It's been done well, and it's been done, not so good. Uh, but possession is so much broader. Possession and obsession are very closely related. You can be possessed by love, by anything. And in my personal life, I'm a mountaineer. And whenever I climb mountains, I sense there's some sort of life in the mountains, like they possess souls, like they have their own specific characters, and some are very welcoming and others are very hostile. And I think it wouldn't be cool to write a book where this character, a mountaineer, comes back from the mountains after an accident, climbing but he's missing. But he's possessed by the force of nature itself, by the force of this mountain, and it changes him and everything around him. So again, it's a concept that we all know, possession, but then I try to twist it around in some new way that hasn't been done before. That
Mhm.
makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Something that I absolutely love exploring is like, places that people have, been to for years and created a history in, and
Yeah,
that in itself can make it alive and
yeah,
possess, people who are there and, new people who come in experience a place as if, it's a thing that's alive.
yeah.
And I feel like that's why haunted houses, are such a great uh, uh, theme in horror
Oh
because
yeah, yeah.
it
You know
just, yeah.
what I've discovered when because Hex was released in many countries around the world, like 30 countries or something, and then I was lucky enough to tour in many of them. So I toured in North America and South America, in Asia, and in Europe, and wherever I went, because I wondered, does a story like that work in different cultures? Does it?
Mm,
But I found that wherever I went, yes, people, there were nuanced differences in the way they took the story, For instance, in China, where the book was released, because this town is closed off from the outside world because they have this big secret with the witch walking around town, and they cannot spill the secret. So there's like a conservative government body over town that, a town council basically, that checks everyone's internet connections, their, what they do in socials. You cannot speak about it. There's no freedom in that sense. And I remember when I was in Beijing and Taiwan later on, especially in mainland China, of course, where people said, this is our reality. This is what we live in. We have a government that um, checks our social media, and that you're punished if you say the wrong things. And so for them, these differences are there in the way people from different cultures read a book like that. But underneath that, there's like a layer where wherever you're from, whether it's from Argentina or Brazil or from Canada or New Zealand or Taiwan, um, it's the image of this figure with stitched up eyes and stitched up mouth entering your bedroom at night, staring at you from the edge of your bed. It's as simple as that. The feeling that your safe space is invaded by some outside presence that you don't know what it wants and what it's looking for. That's what we all fear, apparently, no matter where you come from.
Mm. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So you were talking about Echo um, earlier, which is your latest work, correct? Wow,
Yes.
there it is.
And I even got a different fit. This is the North American version. This is the UK and Australian
Oh,
version.
beautiful
Totally
cover
great. Yeah, fantastic.
art. Yeah, so would you like to talk about what inspired it and a little bit more into the themes that you explored? Because you were talking about, the uh, mountaineering and possession. What prompted you to explore that and how you did it?
So, um, a little bit I touched upon already, that feeling that mountains are alive, and that this would be a great way to tell a possession story. It's a mountain climber has a horrible accident up there in the mountains, comes back, um, and is possessed by the mountain that he tried to climb, and it changes him and everything around him. Um, that's what started it. There's a couple of other, like one situation I found myself in, um, when I was living in a house where I lived before I lived here. There was an attic, and that attic room was, a typical wooden attic with, like this one actually, with, slanting roofs. And the only way to get there was a hole in the ground, and the hole in the ground led to like a very steep staircase that would lead you to like the lower floors where the bathroom was. I remember I woke up one night, in the middle of the night, and I needed to go to the bathroom. So I walked with my sleepy face to the hole in the ground, and I stared down. And for this glimpse of a moment, I imagined there were people there and they were staring up at me. And it jolted me, and I ran back to bed and, duck under the covers, of course. And then I started to wake up a bit more. And then I was like, oh, yeah, I must have imagined this, obviously, because I was living alone and there can't be anything there. So I figured, okay, I'll turn on the lights. I open my laptop. I put on some nice music, some nice video clip on YouTube, just to ease my mind. And then I walk back. And I remember halfway back to the hole in the ground, I was stopping, and I was like, okay, what if these people are still there? And what if they've come just a little bit closer? And then I didn't dare to go to the bathroom anymore all night. Um, and that's what a situation that prompted the opening of Echo. So the first chapter of Echo is exactly that. It's a young woman who finds herself alone in the mountains in a chalet in Switzerland, and sees people in the staircase, and every time she goes back to look, they're a little bit closer, and she's supposed to be alone in the house. It's a
Ah,
very creepy scene. um, Aside from, because that's those basic triggers that triggers you to write scary scenes. I love those when those happen. They're scary
mhm.
when they happen, but they make good storytelling. um aside from that, when I was approaching the book, I figured, yeah, this is the mountaineering story, of course, but it's not. Um, the book is mostly told from the perspective of the mountaineer's partner, his boyfriend, who is the one who stays at home, who doesn't like the mountains, who hates the mountains, who's afraid of his lover going to the mountains all the time because, you know, you're risking your life for whatever you might find up there. And it might seem like a very, you know, irresponsible thing to do. And um, and I wanted to write about that because I have that in my own personal life as well. When you are a mountaineer, and I'm not at all a professional mountaineer, I'm an amateur and I do it on a very, you know, laid back level, if you will. But still, whenever I'm in the mountains and I feel completely in control of what I do, together with my climbing buddy, I'm climbing a peak, and it's challenging. We use ropes, we use the ice axes, all that stuff. But then when you go back to the campground and you read on like the Swiss police website that on that same mountain a week ago, two people have plummeted from their death to their death. And then I'm like, yeah, those two people didn't think they would die up there as well. And that makes it coming, you know, it makes it, you know, very close and hits home that way. And when you are in a relationship, and I am now in a relationship, I've been now together now for 9 years. My partner doesn't really like when I go up there. I mean, he's scared that something happens, and rightly so. So at some point, you start thinking about these. Yeah, am I making the right decisions to be doing this? You know, and I thought there was a pretty good story to tell, and that's the main story in Echo.
Yeah. And having the theme of climbing this, big thing, being surrounded by, mountains in this big, challenging environment by,
Yeah.
taking on uh, nature, but then having that change you and possess you and, for better or worse. Like, I feel like that's a really powerful and relatable concept.
It's the quintessential Gothic theme, if you will. I like the old Gothic novels all were about being um, you know, man confronting nature, confronting like the borders of what we know, standing in front of something much wider and grander than we are, and
Hmm.
being awe-inspired by it. It's that exact sense that you feel when you are in nature and when you are um, facing a mountain that's so much bigger and stronger than you know can kill you in an instant. um, and sometimes it does. And therefore, you know, it's Echo is my love letter to the Gothic novel. I deliberately named every chapter to one of the Gothic classics, like from the Mountains of Madness, obviously, the Valley of Unrest by Edgar Allan Poe, The Invisible Man, In the Hills, the Cities, more modern story by Clive Barker, for instance. And they all, you know, they all have a motto in front of them from that book. For instance, this is in the hills, the city.
Hmm.
And they all have done then a quote from the particular work, and this time Clive Barker's, who very
Uh,
happily gave us permission to do that. And that quote then, you know, reflects something that happens later in the chapter, of course. So
Ooh, perfect.
yeah, yeah, it's a great. If you like horror and gothic fiction, there's a lot to discover in this book. There's a lot of cross references to all sorts of different works.
Amazing.
I like to do
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, and like the other, I mean, even though the genre is, completely different, I feel like, Eldritch horror also kind of tends to follow along that vein of being inconsequential to this big thing that is foreign and,
Yeah,
doesn't care about humans and our day-to-day lives and the
yeah.
things that we do.
Our insignificance in the universe. Yeah,
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 just kind of like really building on that existential kind of
yeah.
um, thoughts. Maybe not even dread, but just yeah. Um, so in your other works and maybe even in Echo, how do you approach monster design? Kind of changing the topic a little bit.
Yeah. So I like the kind of horror stories where I like the stories where you can relate to best because they are human. I like, because we are all human, obviously. We know what it is like to be afraid, whether we are in an actual threatening situation or whether it's about losing a loved one or whether it's anything we can be afraid of. We all know what fear is, and it's a very strong emotion. And I like the kind of stories that tell that human experience, but we all fear, obviously, the things that we cannot explain. And in horror, the monsters are symbols of these fears. And what I like to do is I'd like to tell, you know, I don't like to show the monster too much. I like stories. I mean, you know what it's like when you watch a horror movie, the moment that you actually see the monster, when you see the claws or the red eyes or whatever, it becomes less scary because the
Mhm.
suggestion of it, the ambiguity of it, is more scary than the actual monster itself
Yeah.
often.
Our
Um,
imagination can be
yes,
even more terrifying than, yeah, because then
exactly
we
that.
know what to
Yeah,
expect and it's done.
we all have a movie or a book, but in many cases it's a movie where that really scared the hell out of us, and that always hits us in a moment that we're like on the brink of childhood and adulthood. In my case, that was actually the U.S. remake of The Ring. Great movie, fantastic movie, I think. I remember seeing that in cinema, and you have that, of course, the monster, Samara Morgan, with the black hair hanging in front of her face, climbing out of that well, out of the television, all that. Um, what is so scary about her is that you don't see her. You don't see her face. That black hair is hanging in front of it, right? And even in the first movie, you don't see her that often. Only very late in the movie, you discover it's actually about her. It's first about this cursed videotape, and then there's the whole mystery around it. Some people have died. So what's going on? It's only very late that you see her, and I like that. The sequels not so good because it's her and then you see her all the time and she becomes less threatening that way. I got myself into a pickle when I was writing Hacks. That's a new US cover, by the way. It's also pretty awesome.
Mhm.
It's, because in the case of Hacks, with these people being used to this witch being present in town and everywhere around, and everyone has seen her multiple times. She enters your homes. Um, you see the monster all the time. And so I had a challenge. So how am I going to make that scary? Obviously, what I did is I closed her eyes, I closed her mouth because they're stitched up because people feared her evil eye and back in the day. But then throughout the novel, you discover that she's actually not so much the monster; it's the people themselves who are the monsters, and that's where the really scary stuff happens in the book. Um, and still, yeah, people can fear the image of her standing in your bedroom at night and all that, but it's the actual human evil that pops up out of their superstitions, out of their fears, that poses the real threat in the book. So only that shows up later, and that again, that's not showing the monster, from page one. So, but other than that, yes, I like iconic monsters. I mean, obviously, the Samara Morgan is iconic in the way that she has that black hair. I see a lot of people now cosplaying Catherine, the witch from Hacks, which is fantastic because it's an iconic image with the stitched up eyes and the stitched up mouth and the chains around her body, and then it's those elements that make something stand out and make something having the chance of becoming this icon in horror, which is awesome. Um, uh, but I'd like most of all not to show the monster too soon, if
Mhm.
that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And like two
What kind of
things.
monsters do you like?
Oh man. Oof. Too many. I know that's the opt-out thing, but I absolutely agree with the don't show the monster at
Yeah.
maybe even ever. Because for me, like a monster, I mean, first, it doesn't have to be like this physical being that has, an iconic visage, visage, whatever, image.
Yeah. Hmm.
Um, it can be an idea, it can be a place, it can be in in Hex. I mean, it was like even the monster ended up being the people in the society. Um, like ultimately a monster is something that scares us and something that challenges us and follows us and hunts us, and that can be a myriad of things, and we can
Yeah.
explore that in all kinds of ways. And
Yeah.
the my favorite is just when it's enshrouded, because I feel like one of the core fears that people have is the fear of the unknown.
Yeah.
um, and when we don't have control, and sometimes when we have control, but it's hopeless. And I feel like that's why video games are very effective, because they force that, autonomy onto you.
Yeah. Hmm.
And like when you were talking about going down uh, the dark, the stairs, gosh, when I was a kid, whenever my parents needed anything from the basement, that was the bane of my existence. My day was ruined. Um, because I knew nothing was down there.
But
I like,
still.
but still, like
Yeah.
the imagination is such a strong thing,
Yeah.
and it doesn't have to be the dark that represents the unknown. But for me as a kid, looking down that dark hallway, I couldn't, sometimes I didn't even imagine a certain thing. I didn't imagine like hands, suddenly crawling up the stairs and then grabbing my ankles, or water flooding up and then drowning me, or, a killer waiting around the corner with a knife. Like sometimes I didn't even imagine that. It was just dark, bad, bad,
Yeah. Yeah.
something,
Yeah.
danger.
And it's those childhood experiences and those fears that they enthrall that they stay with you, and that's what triggers our fear, but also our curiosity for horror, I guess. I and especially when every now and then these kind of situations slip into the real world, and if you're lucky, they are not killing you, but if you're unlucky, they are. In my case, I, when I was 9 years old, we have a tradition in the Netherlands that you have to go door by door selling stamps for charity. Every school kid does it. So you go door by door, you have your stamps, and you collect money for charity that way. So I remember I in my hometown, there was this apartment block, the lower floor, so the ground floor, and I was going door by door there. I remember ringing this one doorbell, and this door opened, and you've probably seen Carrie, right? Stephen King's Carrie.
I might have at one point when I was little.
It's the girl at the prom who gets a bucket of blood over her, basically.
Okay, I
Um,
have seen the
yeah,
iconic
yeah,
images.
yeah,
Yes.
exactly. That's what she looked like. This door opened. There was a young woman standing there. She was had a nightgown on. She was covered in blood, and
Always the
um,
nightgown.
yeah, yeah. And I remember most of it came from the nose area, but it covered her gown like that. And she looked sick. Um, I I to this day I don't know what it was, whether it was a very bad nosebleed that with high fever kept running and running, or whether it's a case of home violence or an accident or whatever. I do not know. But I do know that I was 9 years old, standing there with my stamps, just being paralyzed. And she didn't say anything. And I didn't say anything as well because I was, so what do you do? And at some point, because I was raised pretty politely, and my inclination was to, run, of course, but I couldn't do that because that broke through my upbringing. So at some point, I regained my voice and I said to her, "Oh, you don't look too well today. You know what? I'll come back another day." And then I ran. Um, and I was at home, and I didn't dare tell my mom because it was so traumatizing. but then at night, obviously, she showed up at my bed in my nightmares. Next day,
No.
again. She was just haunting me that way. And I never have discovered what happened to her or if she ended up, I hope she ended up well. Um, but it's those kind of experiences that sometimes literally a door opens in your life and something horrible is waiting there. And that's when these childhood fears slip into reality. And when they happen when you are a child, they make this huge impact on you. And me, it triggered the reality of, yeah, this is horror. This can happen actually. And this is what I want to write about.
Mm, yeah. Uh, I see we have a question.
Okay.
If you'd be interested. Okay.
Yeah, sure.
All right. I just realized we have 5 minutes until we have to close up. So after the question, would you want to talk about your up and coming work
Oh, sure.
or?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome.
Hit me with a question.
All right. The question is this. From Marissa. Do you do most of your writing in Dutch or English? And have you found that the story comes across differently based on the different language being used?
Interesting. I do most of my writing in Dutch. I then work with translators, and then when the work's translated, I edit the translation because my English is good enough to edit. I don't feel comfortable writing in English. I've done it with a couple of short stories, but writing a full novel in a language that's not your native tongue is a challenge, and it slows you down like hell. And then so I work closely together with translators, and I do find that indeed nuances in language can trigger different emotions, if you will. There's a different, sometimes there's like a bit of different order in the way you use words to trigger a certain emotion in Dutch than you would do in English. It's very subtle, but there is that difference. So it is always a bit of puzzling um, when I see a translator translating a scene, a paragraph, even a sentence, and as yeah, translated very well what I intended to say in Dutch. But if you turn this and this around in English, it hits you more powerfully. So that there is that nuanced difference, and um, in English, I have the ability to work on that. Uh, but then from English, it's translated to many other languages, and at some point, you also have to trust the translator to do their work well. And from experience, and because when you're from a smaller language group like I am from the Netherlands, where we speak Dutch, there are only like 25 million people in the world speaking Dutch. You read a lot of translation. I sometimes I compare, for instance, translated works by from a Stephen King novel, for instance.
Mhm.
And there are nuanced differences in the original, the way King
I
wrote
have
it.
one of his in French right now.
Oh, which one is that?
Oh, the Anatomy of Horror. I'm
Oh,
trying to learn French, so
great.
oof. But yeah, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, great. No, great to see all those editions. The French editions look great. I remember. But um, there are nuanced differences, and sometimes it works better in the original. And so I'm happy to be able to be working in English as well, so I can get it all right the way I want it, and then others can translate it to other languages.
Mm,
Later
yeah.
today, I think there's a panel where I'm also on with about translation, so I'm sure we'll
Oh,
talk more about it. Yeah.
yeah. Attendees, mark that down.
Yeah.
All right. So with the last minute or two, would you want to close it off with talking about your upcoming book and things to expect and how to find you after?
Yeah. So you can find me on Instagram. Also Twitter. I'm more of an Instagrammer than I'm a Twitterer, so Instagram's better in my case. Um, I there are a couple of film projects in the work. Hex is being turned into a TV show at the moment by Gary Dauberman and James Wan, which is exciting. And then the new book has been out in the Netherlands for a little bit. It's called Oracle, Oracle in Dutch. This is the Dutch edition, obviously. The fun thing about Oracle is that I mean, it's a very adventurous, creepy story. It's high speed. It's like a Dutch reviewer called it like it's like a James Bond novel with horror in it. And he
Lovely.
went it in all the good ways, basically. So I like that. It's very fast paced. But there's also a character from Hacks. If you read Hacks, Robert Grimm, the guy who ran the control center in town, this is like this older, grumpy guy who has his heart in the right place, but hates society and hates authority, especially. Um, he is 10 years after the events of Hex, he's been, pulled out of his retirement to investigate his new case in Oracle. I really had a lot of fun doing that. It's about Oracle is about a ghost ship and about something really bad in the seas.
Love it. So many themes that I enjoy, especially
Yeah.
the gruff detective who's seen too much and
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
oh, love it. Well, we're at the 350 mark.
All right.
So yeah, thanks attendees for listening. Thank you, Thomas, for a wonderful discussion. Uh,
Thank you for having me. Apologies again. I had some glitches logging in, but luckily we figured it out.
yeah, exactly. Technology, it happens.
Yeah.
But yes, enjoy the rest of the conference. And yes, have a lovely day, everyone.
Have a good day.